Dithda hadina pabuni, the bocasto MESKLA Brewyon Drudh, Ostis Genev Sove Berryman. Hello and welcome everyone to the MESKLA Brewyon Drudh podcasts, hosted by me, Sove Berryman. MESKLA Brewyon Drudh is a multi-platform project using sculpture making and conversation to explore contemporary Cornish cultural identity. Through workshops, podcasts, a symposium and an exhibition, the project invites people to share their experiences of identity and Cornwall, and their views on Cornish culture and its relationship to land, language, heritage, tourism, the Cornish diaspora and much, much more. These podcasts record conversations with guests whose research or lived experience touches on the project themes. The views, thoughts and opinions expressed are the speaker's own. All conversations are carried out with a spirit of generosity and openness, creating space for the discussions to twist and turn. And I'm very grateful to all who have taken part. For this 9th podcast, I visit Cornwall-based songwriter, vocalist, choir leader, researcher and writer Angeline Morrison for a conversation at her home with a small intervention from her cat. Angeline is actively concerned with raising awareness about the hidden historic black presence in the UK and has recently released her acclaimed album, The Sorrow Songs, Folk Songs of Black British Experience, on Topic Records. We join the conversation with Angeline about to tell us about her research for this album. Govenek and beus, omlowenhe goslowes orto. I hope you enjoy listening. Hi Angeline, thank you so much for joining me for a MESKLA podcast and for hosting me in your cosy kitchen on this blowy day where we have a host of chocolate and biscuits.
We've got so much chocolate and so many biscuits. Thank you for having me and for this lovely badge. Sove's just given me a beautiful enamelled MESKLA badge.
Yes, we're both sporting our MESKLA badge. I might take a photo of them for the website. So, Angeline, I invited you to be part of my MESKLA podcast programme because of your research project, which, did that begin in 2021, 2020, when you first told me about it?
Probably 2020, that was when the idea came for the project.
And it has now become an album.
Yes. So exciting. It's an album that is going to be released on October 7th on Topic Records, which is a total dream come true. That's like the Motown records of folk music. And the album is called The Sorrow Songs, subtitle Folk Songs of Black British Experience.
Cool. I'm just really excited about it. I can't wait. I've already ordered it.
Have you?
Like, top fan.
Wow. Oh, thank you. That's so exciting. Well, there's 2 singles out at the moment that you can stream and download. I can tell you about those later if you like. What would you like to talk about first?
Well, first, I would like you to, if you wouldn't mind, just... so one of the things that I'm interested in is this sort of term I use, which fractured cultures. And this idea of cultures becoming broken up, and then how fragments of culture come together. And it felt to me, when you first told me about your project and your research funding that you'd got for it, it felt, I was super excited for you anyway, and about the whole project, but also from a selfish perspective, because I was like, brilliant. I'm really interested in this subject. So perhaps you could tell us a bit about the research you've been doing and sort of what led you to produce this work.
Yeah, happy to. Well, the seeds of the project were really sown a very long time ago, because I've been a real lover of English folk song and UK folk music in general, the folk and traditional music of these islands. I've always loved it, and from going to folk clubs and as a sort of a older child and a teenager, I figured out, okay, this is where you go if you want to hear the songs, and people will sing unaccompanied. I absolutely love unaccompanied singing. There's just something really magical for me about the unaccompanied human voice. It feels so immediate and so raw, and at the same time it's earthy, and there's also something ethereal and kind of almost disembodied about it, which seems like a strange thing to say about something that is coming out of a human body, but nevertheless there is just something so alluring for me about the unaccompanied voice, and all the cadences that you get in traditional UK song and music, the melodies, the wonderful turns of phrase and use of language, and the stories, and the emotive depths that some of these songs can take you to. So, loving all of that, I also couldn't help but notice that there weren't any other black people ever in any of the clubs that I went to. There were no black performers on the stage, and no other performers of colour either, actually. It wasn't just that there was an absence of people from the African diaspora, it was that there was a general absence of people of colour. And the scene is extremely warm and friendly and welcoming, so I think it's really important for me to say this, that I was never made to feel anything other than welcome. And people in folk clubs are brilliant at welcoming you. They love to see new people there, and they love to share their love of the music with other people who also love the music. So that was never an issue. But the issue was that I felt really like the odd one out, always. To the point where it made me think, well, can I ever really be a folk singer? Because the other way, as a child and a young person, you're looking for people who remind you of yourself in the areas that you want to go into. I didn't used to think that girls could be vets, because whenever we took the cat to the vet, the veterinary nurse was always female and the receptionist was always a woman at the various different vet surgeries that we went to, and the vet was always a man. I never saw a woman vet, so I deduced from that as a child that girls can't be vets. And children will make these conclusions, and I just never thought that it was a possibility for me to be a folk singer, however much I love the music and however many songs I learn and sing to myself. And I began to think about my own kind of relationship to this music and my own feeling of belonging here in these islands, in England in particular, where I grew up. And the fact that as someone I'm descended from enslaved African people who were trafficked to the Caribbean, and I'm also descended from white people on one side of my family, from Hebridean Scots. So my heritage is mixed, and my experiences have been those of blackness because of the way I look. I look more black than anything, and I'm very happy to identify as a black woman, and I sometimes describe myself as brown as well. But I'm going a bit off topic there, aren't I? Sorry about that. I'm quite non-linear.
No, I think it's really valuable because anyway, all these conversations are non-linear, and it's important context for the work that you're making anyway, and this project in particular. So I think it's really valuable and generous of you to share.
Oh,
so
well, thank you. I'm glad you're right there. My favourite conversations are the non-linear ones, so I'm happy that we got that in common. Hopefully everybody listening, or at least some of the people listening, will also be cool with that. So I was always looking for people like me in the songs, and there's a song called The Brown Girl. Mm-hmm. It's a traditional song. I made a recording of it recently, and I first heard this as a and when I was in my early teens, and I heard Martin Carthy singing it, the wonderful, amazing Martin Carthy, and he'd set it to a traditional tune called Sweet Kitty, and the song starts off, "I am as brown can be, I have eyes black as sloe." So it's really clear this girl has got dark skin and black eyes, and the general interpretation that's always given for old songs or old poems or old stories where somebody is described as being brown or having brown skin, the explanation is that this is a white person who's been out in the sun. So in the context of this song, the girl is rejected by her false lover, and he's really specific in the rejection. He does like the ancient equivalent of a text dumping. So he writes her a letter from town, and he says, "I don't want anything to do with you anymore because you are so brown." So he's highly specific about the reasons that he's dumping her. He's gone to town, he's got ideas above his station, he wants some refined girl with very pale skin, because in terms of the ever-changing standards of beauty that we're all expected to live up to, at certain points in history in England, to have a white person with suntanned skin was considered unattractive because it was synonymous with being of a lower class or a lower social standing, that you had to work, and you had to work outside, so you were probably a member of the labouring classes. And that's generally the way that this song is interpreted. And, you know, that's perfectly fair enough, it could be right, but I wondered if there was more to it, or there might be more possible explanations. And I tended to keep this to myself for many years, because people would always contradict you and say, well, there weren't any black people in this country before about 1948, before Windrush. This is such a common misconception. Even now, I meet people, and some of these people are very learned, some of these people are like scholars whose opinion I would respect in other things, but in this thing they will contradict me and say, no, you're mistaken, there were no black people. And this is I'm so interested in the fact that this misconception remains quite widespread, even though there have been quite a lot of publications about this. And there have been TV shows and radio shows about the history of black people in these islands, the history of black music in Europe. There's so much that you can find. It's all in the public domain, none of it's actually hidden. If you want to find out about it, it's there. But yet there is still quite a widespread level of misconception about the historic black presence. A lot of people seem to see people of the African diaspora in particular as a recent addition to UK society and culture. And sometimes people will make a concession and they'll say, oh yeah, well, you know, there were slaves here, there were some people who would bring their enslaved people to these islands with them, and in Cornwall there are many houses where enslaved African people were living with those who owned them, and we have photographic evidence of this from probably the mid to late 19th century, when photography became, you know, much more widespread. But it's really important to remember that there were free black people. There were free black people in these islands, and not just in the port cities, not just in the towns, in the countryside, everywhere. We don't really know too much about numbers and concentration, but there would absolutely have been vast areas of the UK where there were no people of colour at all, and where people would be born and live and die and they would never meet a person of colour. That's true, but there were also areas where there would have been, you know, a significant minority of people of colour. And this is the truth. We have evidence for this. I'm not making it up. If people are interested in researching it, they can. The information is right there.
It feels like there's a convenient, like I use the term in sort of inverted commas, narrative or story being told there that is about quite actually whitewashing a history, and I don't know to what ends, but yeah, it's because it's not simply about ignorance of history, is it? It's almost like quite a almost emotional sort of denial.
Well, there are specific choices have been made about which histories are told.
Mm-hmm.
Put it that way, and I think that this is probably a feature of most histories, that specific choices are made about what is told and what is retained, and what is conveniently forgotten or considered not worthy of recording. And that may be for any number of reasons. But those who are recording the histories will always be making choices, won't they, about what they consider to be important to keep and what they don't consider to be important to keep.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I tend to try not to use the term whitewashing.
Sorry.
Because then you always have to say no pun intended or something.
Yeah, yeah.
But it is an appropriate term. It absolutely is appropriate for what happened, and yes, it's appropriate. So, in terms of the evolution and the journey of my idea for this album, that song "The Brown Girl" was really important. So I structured a whole album of traditional song around it, which I released on May Day of this year, on May 1st. And that song was so meaningful to me as a teenage folkie, because I really was the only one, certainly the only one that I knew. I know now that I was absolutely not the only one, but at the time I knew no other black or brown folkies of any age, let alone teenage folkies. And so that song was so meaningful to me because I've described it as a talisman. And it really did have that kind of magical significance, because I was able to imagine into that song a historic black heroine, or a heroine who at least was brown because she had a black ancestor. Like, she may not have been, the daughter of two displaced African people. She may have had an African grandparent or great-grandparent or something, and was considered to be brown with eyes black as sloe because of that. Maybe she was East Asian, maybe she was South Asian, there are all sorts of possibilities. But I just kept that in my heart, and every time I sang that song, I was singing the heroine as this young woman of colour, that she was in my imagination. So I was able to do my own restoring, and that's the word I use for the album. It's a work of restoring. I was able to do my own personal restoring, and this was before I had ever learned the truth about the historic black presence in these islands. So that song kept me going before I learned the truth. Learning the truth was extraordinary. Learning the truth that, I just kept thinking to myself, we do belong here. We really do belong here. Since Roman times. And I only say that because that's as far back as records go.
And you uncovered this truth, the evidence. Again, I use sort of advisedly, through the period of research that you carried out in the making of this work.
Yes, I did. I came to a knowledge about the historic nature of the black presence in these islands a few years before, actually, but it was during the aftermath of George Floyd's murder that the ideas really started to coalesce in my head, and I began to put everything together, and I began to think, well, okay, given the fact that I now know for certain that black people and other people of colour were living in these islands alongside white people, working with them, sometimes working for them, sometimes being owned by them, but not exclusively, and they were present. So why aren't there any traditional songs that mention them? So that was the first thing. I thought to myself, why don't we have, given that we do have a history of a black presence in this country, why do we not have a body of folk song that is the equivalent to the spirituals of America and all the African American folk songs, which are so powerful and so important as a container for that experience, and that kind of can provide healing and can provide a place to give voice to things which are really unspeakable. You don't have anything like that, and so of course there are not exact equivalents. So because of practical things like climate, the plantations where you would have very big populations of trafficked and enslaved African people, you could have those in places like the United States. You couldn't have them in the United Kingdom because we don't have the climate to grow the crops and so on. So the concentration of people of colour in these islands would have been a lot smaller, and these ancestors are likely to have been more dispersed. So all of these things have an effect on the common songs that they might sing. But there is absolutely no way that there's no historic black music in these islands. That's just not even possible. Humans, wherever they go in the world, they create music, they bring music, they share music. It's a human trait. So when I next get a moment, I'm going to carry on with this research, but I'm going to be specifically looking for the historic black music of these islands, because this project started out with exactly that. I was looking for the historic black folk music of these islands, and what I was able to find, and my research is ongoing, and I'm really clear about this in my interviews, it's ongoing because I wanted to get on with the composition, so I've had to take a bit of a break from the research. But what I have been able to find so far is songs with references to black people, but they're clearly not written by black people unless they were, commissioned, unless, a black broadside writer perhaps was paid to compose something, like write a story about this. If you're writing to order, then you can't, then you've got to write what you're told. But there is no possible way that we do not have a historic black folk music that is that belongs to the UK.
So its presence within records or archives or whatever comes down to the sort of gatekeepers of those records and archives. So who makes the choice of what is saved or preserved and what isn't? Yes,
very much so, and archives and records are always very carefully gate-kept and curated, and also it's difficult to search them as well, because songs which are authentically of black origin, folk songs, may not reference blackness at all. So a lot of these songs may survive, but without any reference to the fact that they were of black origin. Do you see what I mean? So, for example, a lot of the spirituals and the secular African American folk songs that we have, they don't all make reference to blackness or to brown skin or to any of those things, but yet they are folk songs of black origin. So that's one possible reason why it might be difficult to locate them. But also they may not have been collected, they may not have been considered worth recording. There are many, many possible reasons. Yes, so when many of the traditional songs that we have now were collected in what's called the first folk revival of the late 19th and early 20th century, there was a great sense of nationalistic pride. England was known as the land without song. Other European countries were very proud of their singing traditions and their traditional music, and it was generally considered that England did not have a traditional music of its own at that point. It's really difficult to imagine now, because everyone alive today is I think very aware of the English folk tradition, even if they're not really plugged into the music and engaged with it, and even if they're not interested in it, they know it's there. They know that we have a really long-standing and fascinating tradition of folk music and folk song that's comparable with anywhere else in the world. But so at the time when the big collections were happening, there was definitely a feeling of creating a sense of Englishness, or finding finding these songs which would then be a signifier of that purity or that authentic notion of Englishness.
I see. Yeah.
And there was also a sense that the in the first folk revival of the late 19th, early 20th century, there was a sense that the most authentic version of Englishness would be found in the rural poor. The rural poor of England would be the people who would be the most pure, the most kind of authentic, untainted by civilization and education and all of those things, close to nature. There was all of these ideas were really popular in culture at the time. So it's no coincidence that the huge body of song that we're lucky enough to have, and respect to those collectors for finding and preserving those songs and studying them and allowing us to have them all. But it's really important to remember that they were collected in a particular cultural context, and that has had an effect.
So then, thinking about authenticity and sort of rebuilding things, rebuilding stories that aren't that haven't been recorded or kept. Now, somebody else who's another podcast guest has spoken about the building of that it's totally fine to build things from these fractured, build anew from the fractured sort of moments that we can collect, because that's what might be left from someone else having fractured it. So that rebuilding, and I sort of vision this as like a rebuilding of a pot that might have some sort of broken spaces in it, and then you could perhaps make another bit of clay or fill it in, and that seems to me to be quite a fair, and I'm doing my own rambling now.
Ramble away. That's a folk song, actually. Ramble away. Yeah, I love that analogy of the pot. I have been thinking about all the ways that we can piece back together that which has been shattered over the course of nearly 500 years, and that mending of pottery. Mending is the metaphor that I come back to all the time. Mending. It's got to be a work of mending. And when you watch spiders mending their webs, that's really instructive. I love that. They take something that's been broken and they remake it, and it might be slightly wonky, but it's a thing of beauty, and it was remade with loving attention, and the spider will just take as long as it takes to do that reworking and that mending. Just take as long as it takes, because if something has been broken for nearly 500 years, you will not be able to fix that thing instantly. It will take a really long time to mend that, and you don't know how it will look when it's mended as well.
It's interesting thinking about the spider also, just in that, going back to the sort of bodily moment, that there's something about, it seems to me that mending needing to take place over a period of time that spans some generational bodies, with with elements perhaps being a little bit fixed and then going back and fixing them some more.
Yeah, that's lovely. I really like that.
Do you then, like, another thing that was spoken about, I spoke about with someone else recently, was around the notion of responsibility. So you're an artist, you're a contemporary artist in the 21st century, and you're very good at it as well.
You too.
And then, do you feel a sense of responsibility about making this work? I mean, it's important for you as an individual. It feels to me like it's also a gift.
Yes, I absolutely feel that and all of those things that you say are true. It's really important to me personally, and it's no coincidence that that this work came through me with my particular set of experiences, and my particular relationship both to my enslaved African ancestors and to my embodied life in these islands. That I feel like I have a notion of responsibility to my African ancestors. I really do. And I feel that as a descendant of enslaved African people, I feel like I have a responsibility to give voice to the truth of the presence of these ancestors in these lands here, because that's a thing that is very present in discourses about race, about belonging, and there is an assumption that if somebody has brown skin or black skin, or if they look a bit different in any way, that and they're present here in these islands, that they don't really belong, or they must have come here from somewhere. Well, everybody came here from somewhere. I mean, really. You'd have to work very, very, very hard to find someone, whatever they look like, you would have to work really hard to find somebody whose heritage is not mixed in some way.
Mm-hmm.
The history of humanity is a history of movement around the globe for various reasons. So I'm really interested in that, in all of those notions about belonging and about land and about presence, because that suggestion that if you have black skin or brown skin, then obviously you don't belong here in these islands is something that I'm specifically shining a light on,
mm-hmm.
and showing that it isn't true.
And I wondered then about, there's something there as well about the folk tradition being very much connected to rural situations as well, and that rural, I think about the sort of the gaze upon the rural is one that paints it, much as you described earlier, as this sort of white working person on the land, sort of pastoral, with, you know, maybe a beautiful working class maiden tilling a field in the corner.
Definitely the beautiful working class maiden, yeah. She's got to be there.
Dear of her. But that sort of, there's so much invested in that picturesque, sort of ideal, again inverted commas, that has been sold for now generations. There's a continued investment in it.
Yeah.
And linking to tourism a bit here.
Mm-hmm. I was just thinking about the holiday industry.
Yes. Well, yeah, I mean, it seems to me that very much sort of British rural tourism is sold from a white nostalgia perspective, this kind of false reality of the rural being a white space, and this is sort of, again, inverted commas, like traditional Britain. And obviously we're in Cornwall, and MESKLA is a project that's looking at Cornish contemporary identity, and it feels that is very much the case, and a problematic case in Cornwall. So yeah, the work that you're doing is also very much challenging that specific view as well, not only of these islands in its total, but of that rural experience and who belongs within that rural picture.
Very much, yes. My restoring is absolutely about that. Although not all of the songs are set in a rural like narrative, but I was really interested when you were talking, because that notion is really powerful. That notion of the rural, the soul of a nation belonging to its rural poor. it's so powerful that you even hear people saying, you know, if someone is talking about having gone on holiday, for example, let's say they went to Greece, I don't know, and somebody might say to them, well, did you visit the real Greece? Meaning, did you just stay in cities, or did you actually go out to the rural areas and see what it's really like? And so that to this day there is, I think, an association, and it might be unconscious, but it's powerful and it persists, that association of the rural experience, anywhere you go in the world, being an authentic experience, and the urban experience, which involves technology and education and things like that. It's those things are seen somehow as less authentic and you know, an addition, an unnecessary addition, or things that take us away from nature and away from the reality of who we are. Those notions are really persistent. Those notions were not invented by the folk song collectors in the first folk revival, but they did hook into them because those philosophies were very, very powerful, particularly at the time. And Cecil Sharp, who was one of the key collectors, and he collected so very many songs, thousands of songs he collected personally, he was very clear that he was looking for the soul of the English people. He wanted songs which represented the soul, or the truth, or the heart. He did use the word soul, S-O-U-L, of Englishness. He was really looking for something that embodied Englishness, and was, you know, in modern parlance, we might say that the folk songs were branded in a particular way, and that branding was very successful. And generally speaking, and I include myself in this, when we've got a particular agenda, and everybody has an agenda, don't they? Whatever we're doing, everyone's got an agenda, but generally speaking, we're not aware of our agendas, are we? Or awareness of agenda is something that you have to be mindful of. I try my best to be mindful of it. I don't always
yeah,
don't always
I know
succeed,
what you mean. No.
But it's really important to be mindful of it as well. Yeah, but the early collectors of folk songs, I think they were very, very heavily influenced by the cultural turn at the time, which was, you know, people in England in particular were very hungry for a body of song that represented Englishness. It was really meaningful for them.
So this was late 19th century, early 20th century.
Yeah, it's kind of like, you know, the way people are really rude about English cooking nowadays.
Yeah.
It was the same about music back then.
And I mean, that was when the sort of arts and crafts movement was sort of coming about as well. And again, part of that sort of fetish around the purity of hands labour. And interestingly, at the turn of the recent millennium, we also had this surge of sort of new interest in kind of craft and hands making, and like knitting circles coming about again, you know, stitch and bitch or whatever. So I suppose just thinking about where we are based, we're based in Cornwall. Do you see like a particular relevance to this work that you're doing, or the content of this research, to Cornish cultural identity, the identity of people within Cornwall?
That's a very interesting question, for many reasons, right? So I'm going to start by explaining what the album is doing, and then I'm going to move on to tell you something that happened recently on Twitter that has to do with Cornwall, and a couple of things to do with the album that have to do with Cornwall. So first of all, the Sorrow Songs album is a work of restoring. I used that word earlier. I use it specifically about this album because the true story of black people living here has you know, been forgotten or written out or airbrushed out or whatever. So I'm restoring the real lives and partly imagined lives also, because sometimes there isn't that much detail available, and as a songwriter you think, hooray, now I can make some stuff up. I'm restoring them back into the folk songs of these islands. So I'm very aware I can't write a folk song. I can write a song in the folk style, but obviously I'm writing brand new songs and I'm composing them, so I'm aware that I cannot write a traditional song, but what I can do is make a gift to the folk community of a body of songs which are about the experiences and lives of real black historic characters in these islands. I say historic, there's a couple of examples from the 20th century, so that's not too long ago. So that's the purpose of the album, and you mentioned a gift before, and it's a gift to my ancestors, and it's also a gift to the folk community now. That's the way I see it, that my biggest dream for the album is that people will want to sing the songs and the ancestors will be remembered, and hopefully I'll be doing something positive for the folk community as well, because they'll have this, some new songs to sing about subject matter and people who weren't previously present in the songs. Do you mind if I let the cat in? He's been very loud.
Oh no, please do.
Very loud. One sec. Come on in, Ted.
Hello.
So that's
Love
what the
cats.
album. I love cats too. Cats are the best, aren't they?
Great.
I love them. I want to collect more.
Yeah,
So,
time to go out
Time
again.
to go out again. He just likes to know he's the boss, that's all. He just likes to know that he's the most important person in the household. Okay, so on Twitter about 2 days ago, no, about more than that, about 3 days ago, I saw a response to my pinned tweet. It was very interesting. Someone was challenging the sort of worthwhileness of this project because Topic Records had described me as a Cornwall-based songwriter, which is true. That's what I am. So this person who had tweeted was questioning what I could possibly have to say of value about Black British experience from living in Cornwall, because this person said that and this was a black person who was tweeting, and they said that the people that they knew who had moved to Cornwall, so presumably this person was writing from elsewhere, or Devon, had done so in order to ingratiate themselves with white people. I'm trying to remember exactly what he said. And I was really... I didn't know how to respond to this for ages. I thought, okay, well maybe... I didn't understand this this person's notion that because I live in Cornwall, it must mean that because there are so few black people here, and statistically Cornwall is the most has the highest percentage of white-bodied people in the whole of the UK. That's a statistic.
Oh right, that's interesting.
Yeah. So this person has some black friends, and they've moved to Devon and Cornwall, and this, as far as the tweeter is concerned, they did that so that they could ingratiate themselves with white people and or whatever. And I thought, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I didn't know how to respond. In the end, I responded very factually with what the album is about. And I said there are 2 stories from Cornwall on the album, the rest are from elsewhere in the UK. And Cornwall, and this is, the second part of my response. I said Cornwall has a very interesting and often hidden black history. And that's the truth. People don't know about it. People forget. People remember that Liverpool, Bristol, Cardiff, London, people are very aware of these cities as big, important international port cities. And so people are quite happy to accept that there will be a black presence in these places. So this is a history that has, again, this is a real and true history that is very easy to find out about, but in terms of contemporary consciousness, people forget about that. People see Cornwall as this rural idyll, which is, I guess, part of the tourist industry myth, and people forget about Cornwall as a county that had 2 extremely active international port cities and a mining industry. They just think about the rural white spaces.
Mm-hmm.
It's very interesting how this perception of Cornwall has overridden all the other truths of Cornwall. Isn't that interesting? And people just want to think about the rural white idyll here. So that's fascinating. So two of the stories on my album are based in Cornwall. Well, one's Cornwall, one's Isles of Scilly. I decided not to write about Joseph Emedy, the famous violinist, for the simple reason that he's already, I wouldn't say he is well known, but in terms of Cornish black history, a lot of people around the world know about Joseph Emedy, and I wanted to see if I could write about people who are not well known. That was one of the things that I wanted to do. And what's very interesting is I've found quite a lot of photographs of black people in Cornwall, and we're talking about, probably 1850s, 1860s maybe. The Drudh photographer J.F. Moody seemed to photograph quite a lot of black people. A lot of them have been identified as belonging to the Rose family, and the one who I was particularly interested in, and there's a photograph of him. I didn't get permission to use this photograph on the album, but I just want to tell everybody, if you Google Evaristo Muchavela, you will find a picture of the actual man whom this story is about. I wanted to use his picture so much on the album, but I just couldn't get the permission. But he's photographed by J.F. Moody of Drudh. And the story is, what's so extraordinary about his story is that he was owned by a Cornish man named Thomas Johns, and he was a miner. Thomas Johns was not one of the wealthy elite at all. He was a regular guy who worked very, very hard as a copper and tin miner, saved his money, and he went to Brazil, where he bought a 7-year-old African boy who had been trafficked from Mozambique, and that was Evaristo Muchavela. And they lived together for many years in Brazil. We don't really know anything about that chapter of their history, but it seems, from what little we do know, that Thomas Johns treated Evaristo Muchavela well. It seems that even though he was his legal owner, which is highly problematic, even though he purchased a 7-year-old boy, highly problematic, but he does seem to have been kind to him. So what we know is that Evaristo was given a choice. By this time, Thomas Johns was an older man and Evaristo was a young man. So Thomas Johns became very unwell in Brazil, and he knew that he was going to die, and he wanted to die in Cornwall. So he gave Evaristo a choice, and he said, you can come back with me to Cornwall, because I want to die there, or you can stay on in Brazil on your own, and I will give you your freedom. So he offered him his freedom, and Evaristo apparently chose to come back to Cornwall with his master. And by this point, it was no longer legal to own an enslaved person on UK soil, so he had to be reclassified as a servant. Evaristo looked after Thomas, and when Thomas Johns died, or before he died I should say, he made arrangements so that Evaristo would have somewhere to live and could train as a cabinet maker. And he apparently had his cabinet making shop in Drudh. He ran his own business, and he was apparently, quite well liked in the community. He died in 1868, and he is buried in the same grave as the man who owned him.
Oh,
they are buried together in the exact same grave in Wendron Cemetery. Isn't that mind-blowing?
It is. But there would be so much power, like individual power, in being taught these histories.
Oh, absolutely.
From a young age.
Can you imagine how amazing it would be to know your own history, know the history of your people?
Yeah.
In the land where you live. How empowering would that be for children?
Exactly.
That's really meaningful for children. And I'm very focused on children. I do a lot of singing work with children. I'm very devoted to singing with children, helping them develop their individual voices and their creativity. And when you spend a lot of time with children, and when you remember very clearly, as I do, what it means to be a child and how you feel about things, there is no doubt about how important this knowledge is to young people and to tiny people. It's really important. It shapes how you think about yourself. It shapes how you feel about yourself. I would have felt so much more confident and assured, really deep down inside, if I had known about my black ancestors in the UK. Honestly, I would.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel the same way about Cornish history?
Or
lack thereof in schools?
Not so much. I think what I feel is, if I knew more of British history and Cornish history, that I could have had the opportunity to challenge structures earlier in my life, that maybe maybe I would have then been living in a different society that was perhaps more balanced than the one in which we do live. I was another great podcast guest who grew up in Cornwall and is a woman of colour. We spoke about our relationship with land, and I felt that a great gift for me was growing up in Cornwall, in a place where I feel that I'm physically of the land and it's within me. And she very rightly and generously pointed out that some of the experience that she had of being questioned about her right to that belonging and place. And I'm quite mindful of the privilege I have in that.
Yeah, you're very lucky to have that. You're very lucky to have that, because I've always felt a really strong connection and relationship with land and nature, particularly the land here in these islands. I have a real love for it, which transcends and overrides all the times that I've been told I don't belong here, wherever I go. There's a group called Black Girls Hike, which I'm a member of, which is specifically for women of colour going walking in the countryside, because you get funny looks. People don't expect to see you there.
Mm-hmm.
People associate you with cities or with crime or whatever. But you know what? The land doesn't tell you to go home. Land is very accepting.
Mm-hmm.
I know many people of colour who have the same relationship with nature and with land.
Yeah.
In terms of Cornish Black History, or Black History Cornwall, there's so much more there than people in general are aware of, and of course I include myself in this. And one of the amazing things that I learned, which really took me back, was I was talking to an expert on Joseph Emedy, who had spent a lot of time researching him, and it turned out that Joseph Emedy was witness at his friend's wedding. His friend was married in Mabe Church, and his friend was also a black man, and he was described, because this is one of the ways that we can find black people in historic records is because they are sometimes described as, quote, Negro of the parish or something, but their blackness is somehow referenced in official records. So this was a wedding, so it's referenced in official records. So Joseph Emedy was present at the wedding of his friend, another black man who was marrying a white, I believe, Cornish woman. There would have been children of colour in the local school in Mabe.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that mind-blowing?
Yeah.
So think about how much more there is there that we don't know about yet.
Totally.
That's what it
so
is. Every time I find out one of these things, I think, oh my goodness, like there is so much more here than we know, because we only know about the black ancestors for whom there are concrete records in some way. There may have been there will have been so very many more who weren't recorded. When we think about all the people, and all about poor white people who were not recorded, who went through their whole lives without ever being officially recorded because they were poor or because they couldn't write, or for so many different reasons. People who have been buried and there's no grave and there's no record that they were ever even there. So this is the case also when you're looking for black history. You're looking for people who often were not officially recorded, and because of that we can know that there will be so much more there than we know already.
So we're coming to time. It's been lovely speaking with you in this way, Angeline. Thank you. So before we go, I just wanted to touch back to this notion of like storytelling and oral histories and traditions. I'm neurodivergent in a few different ways, and we've spoken about this. And I sometimes feel, so for instance, in relation to the Cornish language, I would love to speak more Cornish. I really struggle with learning a language in a sort of traditional way that languages are taught, going through grammar and such like. However, by picking things up in more of a kind of casual, oral way, connecting it with perhaps manual tasks and just using the odd word here and there, I find that really powerful. And I don't necessarily have to remember exact spellings, but I can sort of feel it kind of bodily, and that becomes part of my storytelling, and I become sort of more confident as like in my cultural identity. And then just linking that to, like, I came to the Birch Tree Folk Choir with you for a while, which was wonderful. And what I really loved about that is, like, we had a conversation at that time about singing, who can sing, who can't sing. And we shared a feeling that everybody can sing, people sound differently. And I've got to say, you know, I don't have a joyous singing voice, but it brings me great joy. And singing in that space and learning that in that space, you didn't give us song sheets with words. You had us learning these orally, and they became sort of body knowledge, and something about like that space was utterly joyful. And so I wondered if you could just say a bit about that, I suppose, connected to that folk tradition, maybe.
Yeah, that's. I'm so interested in everything you say there, and I'm so happy that you loved the choir. There will be more. I will be running more Birch Tree Folk Choir sessions, so look out for those. But yeah, I don't tend to provide lyric sheets when I'm leading choirs or singing workshops, and there's many reasons for that. The main reason is that people tend to look down at the sheets instead of at the other people in the group or at me, and I use my hands when I'm teaching a melody to give an idea of the intervals. So I really need people in the group to be watching what my hands are doing. One hand shows the intervals of the melody, one hand shows the rhythm, and that's the way I teach. So I do find that it tends to kind of take people out of the space in a way. Obviously they're right there and listening, but it's really difficult if I can't engage with people's eyes. And second of all, as you made reference to, the in terms of folk song, there's a very powerful oral tradition, and before any song is collected, it has a long history of having been passed from person to person, orally and orally. So it becomes that body knowledge, and so that's what I really want to keep going in terms of the Birch Tree Folk Choir, is to preserve that tradition of exchanging songs and stories orally, and you learn it in your body. It's very interesting because I am also neurodivergent, but in different ways. I really like words are my friends. So when I'm learning a language, I like to be able to see the word in my head. That helps me to remember it. And it's very important, isn't it, for people who aren't neurodivergent to remember that neurodivergence is so varied and individual. I like to see the words in my head. I recently started to learn Gaelic, which is the language of my dad's family, and the last fluent Gaelic speaker was my great aunt Mary, my dad's aunt, and she was so lovely and really loving. I had a very special relationship with her, and she used to sing to me in Gaelic when I was very little. So it's really important for me to learn that. On the other side, I will never know where my African ancestors came from. I will never know. They were abducted. They were brutally trafficked. I have no idea where they came from, and I am pretty sure there's no way for me to find out. Although I'm very tempted to do one of those DNA tests. I would really like to know. But you see, this is why I feel so like almost envious of people like you who have a relationship to your Cornish identity, which first of all you can be sure that you belong to this land and this land belongs to you, and also you have a relationship to the language. You can trace it. You know where your family comes from, and for my enslaved ancestors, I can't get anywhere close to that knowledge, and that is a really sorrowful feeling, which so many of us share. The people of the African diaspora who are descended from enslaved ancestors, we share this. Might not make sense, but it doesn't need to for me. It's just something that is my truth. I feel really connected and a sense of belonging when I'm with trees or swimming in the sea or walking along a beach or something. That's when I feel most connected to the life of the world and to place. And it doesn't have to do with my DNA, actually. It has to do with the accepting nature of the land and of nature.
That's a really lovely experience to have, and thank you for sharing.
Thank you for having me.
My
it's
pleasure.
So lovely to chat to you.
Miraz agus goslowes. Thank you for listening. Further episodes of the MESKLA Brewyon Drudh podcast can be found on my website, soveberryman.co.uk. That's soveberryman.co.uk, where you'll also find guest biographies and a resource page of links to further reading on the topics discussed. If you feel inspired to join the MESKLA conversation about contemporary Cornish cultural identity, please get in touch with me, Sove Berryman, via my website or social media. You'll find MESKLA Brewyon Drudh on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. The MESKLA Brewyon Drudh podcast and project has been made possible due to a wealth of in-kind help and support from many parties, including the Wenda Perrin Festival, Gorseth Cernay, Cornwall Council's Cornish Language Office, Coethus an Iaith Canuic, Crescent Cernay, Cornwall Neighbourhoods for Change and Falmouth University Falmouth Campus. The project has been supported using public funding by the National Lottery through Arts Council England, and further funding has been gratefully received from Historic England via Redruth Unlimited. Agus Termin, Agus Gwellas. Thank you for your time. See you later.